In the summer of 1987, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev stood before an audience in Murmansk, a frozen port city clinging to the edge of the Kola Peninsula, and delivered a speech that would define Arctic geopolitics for a generation. He proposed a scaling down of military activity in the Arctic. He called for scientific cooperation. He articulated a vision where the great powers would treat the frozen North not as a battlefield, but as a zone of peace where nations could find common cause. For nearly 3 decades, that vision held. The 8 Arctic nations, the United States, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, formed the Arctic Council and agreed to work together on research and environmental protection. Scientists from China, India, and South Korea established research stations on the ice to study how Arctic weather patterns influenced climates thousands of kilometers away. The Arctic became known as an exceptional place, a realm where cooperation trumped competition, where the normal rules of geopolitical rivalry were suspended. But if you looked at the map today, if you examined the military budgets and the diplomatic cables, if you listened to the rhetoric coming from Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, you would see something very different. You would see a frontier that is no longer frozen in time, but melting into the future. You would see a region warming faster than anywhere else on Earth, where the retreat of the ice is revealing resources worth trillions of dollars, opening shipping routes that could reshape global trade, and creating a power vacuum that the world's superpowers are racing to fill. The Arctic is no longer exceptional. It is contested, and what happens in the Arctic will not stay in the Arctic. To understand why the Arctic has become one of the hotly contested regions on the planet, we need to look at the world differently. Forget the traditional Mercator projection map that hangs on classroom walls. Look instead at the view from above, from the North Pole looking down. From this perspective, the Arctic Ocean is not a remote periphery. It is the center, surrounded by 8 nations whose territories extend into the Arctic Circle. Russia dominates the geography, with over half of the Arctic coastline. Its northern border stretches 24,000 kilometers across the frozen sea. Canada and Greenland control vast Arctic territories in North America. The Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, anchor the European flank. And the United States, through Alaska, holds a strategic position across from Russia's eastern edge. During the Cold War, this geography was a chessboard. Going over the pole was the shortest route for intercontinental ballistic missiles traveling between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both superpowers established early warning radar systems, air bases, and submarine patrol zones. The United States built Thule Air Base in northern Greenland in 1951, positioning it as the northernmost military installation on the planet, a sentinel watching the Soviet Union across the ice. The Arctic was a front line, but it was a cold front line, frozen not just by temperature, but by the military doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Neither side wanted to trigger Armageddon over a patch of ice, so the region remained militarized but stable, tense but predictable. When Gorbachev gave his speech in 1987, the world was changing. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The ideological struggle that had defined the 20th century was ending. The Arctic, which had been a strategic battleground, could become something else. A laboratory for international cooperation, a place where humanity could prove it was capable of managing shared resources peacefully. And for a time, it worked. In 1996, the 8 Arctic nations signed the Ottawa Declaration, establishing the Arctic Council. It was not a military alliance or a trade bloc. It was a forum for cooperation on environmental protection, sustainable development, and scientific research. Decisions required consensus, giving every nation, regardless of size, an equal voice. Indigenous communities were granted permanent participant status, recognizing that the Arctic was not empty wilderness, but the homeland of the Inuit, Sami, and dozens of other peoples who had lived on the ice for millennia. It was an experiment in governance, an attempt to create a model where nations with vastly different political systems could work together for a common good. And it functioned. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Arctic nations collaborated on search and rescue agreements, oil spill response protocols, and climate research. Non-Arctic states like China, India, and South Korea were granted observer status, allowed to participate in scientific research and discussions, but not in decision-making. The Arctic had a reputation as a zone of peace. Politicians and diplomats spoke of Arctic exceptionalism, the idea that the region was somehow insulated from the geopolitical conflicts that plagued the rest of the world. Even as tensions flared in the Middle East, Ukraine, and the South China Sea, the Arctic remained calm. But that narrative was built on a foundation of ice, and the ice was melting. On February 24, 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine. Within hours, the facade of Arctic cooperation shattered. Western nations suspended Russia from the Arctic Council. Joint research projects were halted. Military drills were canceled. Finland and Sweden, which had maintained neutrality for decades, applied to join NATO, the Western military alliance. Sweden's accession in 2024 completed the transformation. The Arctic map became a line dividing Russia on one side and NATO members on the other. The border between Norway, Finland, and Russia, a border that runs through the frozen Barents region, became, in effect, a front line. Not a shooting war, but a line of strategic competition where every military exercise, every radar installation, every submarine patrol is watched and measured by the other side. And then, the conflict came directly to the Arctic. In August 2024, Ukrainian drones struck a Russian airbase inside the Arctic Circle. It was a symbolic moment. The war that had seemed distant, confined to the fields and cities of Ukraine, had reached the frozen north. The Arctic was no longer insulated from the chaos of the world. It was part of it. Russia's response was predictable. It doubled down on its Arctic presence. The region is critical to Russia's military strategy. Most of Russia's nuclear-armed submarines are based in the Arctic, specifically in the Kola Peninsula. These submarines, lurking beneath the ice, are the cornerstone of Russia's strategic deterrent, the weapons that ensure the survival of the Russian state. Russia has reopened dozens of Soviet-era military bases across the Arctic. Installations that had been abandoned and left to rust in the 1990s have been refurbished and restaffed. New radar systems have been installed. Arctic-capable fighter jets have been deployed. Russian fighter jets have tested hypersonic cruise missiles in Arctic waters, demonstrating their ability to strike targets anywhere on the planet from the frozen sea. And Russian fighter jets have come in close proximity to American aircraft near Alaska. In July 2024, Russian and Chinese bombers flew together near Alaska for the first time, a joint patrol that sent a clear message to Washington. The Arctic is no longer a Western lake. It is contested airspace. The West has responded in kind. In 2024, NATO conducted its largest Arctic military exercises since the Cold War. Tens of thousands of troops trained in Norway, simulating the defense of Northern Europe against a Russian invasion. The United States Army reactivated the 11th Airborne Division in Alaska, a specialized Arctic force designed to operate in extreme cold. New icebreakers are being built. Forward operating bases are being expanded. The architecture of cooperation has been replaced by the architecture of confrontation. The Arctic Council still exists on paper, but it is paralyzed. Meetings are held, but nothing of substance is achieved. The trust is gone. And then, in January 2025, President Donald Trump made a statement that shocked the world. He said the United States needed Greenland for national security purposes. He suggested that acquiring the island was essential not just for American security, but for international security. He said, "We'll go as far as we have to go." It was not the first time Trump had floated the idea. In 2019, he had reportedly asked aides if the United States could purchase Greenland from Denmark. The Danish government had dismissed the suggestion as absurd. Greenland is not for sale. It is a semi-autonomous territory with its own government, its own culture, and its own future. But Trump was not joking, and the reasoning behind his interest was not difficult to discern. Greenland is strategically vital. It sits between North America and Europe, a massive island that controls access to the North Atlantic. The U.S. military already operates Thule Air Base in northern Greenland, home home to radar systems that track ballistic missiles and monitor the Arctic airspace. But Greenland is more than a military outpost. It is a treasure chest of resources. Beneath the ice lie vast deposits of rare earth elements, minerals essential for manufacturing everything from smartphones to fighter jets to wind turbines. Currently, China controls approximately 70% of global rare earth production, giving Beijing enormous leverage over the supply chains that power the modern world. If the United States were to gain access to Greenland's resources, it could significantly reduce its dependence on China. It could secure the raw materials needed for advanced technology and defense systems. It could deny those same resources to rivals. But the response from Greenland was clear. Polls suggest that the majority of Greenlanders do not want to become part of the United States. They want independence. They want control over their own future, free from both Danish and American influence. Greenland's government has stated unequivocally that the island is not for sale. But Trump's comments were not simply bluster, they were a signal. They were a declaration that the United States views the Arctic as a critical arena of competition, a region where American interests must be secured by any means necessary. While the United States and Russia revived their Cold War rivalry, a third player has entered the Arctic game: China. China is not an Arctic nation. Beijing is 1,400 kilometers from the Arctic Circle. But in 2018, China released its first Arctic policy, declaring itself a near-Arctic state and announcing a series of investments it called the Polar Silk Road, an extension of its Belt and Road Initiative into the frozen north. Chinese officials argue that the Arctic affects global climate patterns, ocean currents, and weather systems that impact China. Therefore, China has a legitimate interest in Arctic governance and development. They argue that the Arctic should not be the exclusive domain of the 8 Arctic nations, but should be managed as part of the global commons. This rhetoric makes Arctic nations nervous. They see it as an attempt by Beijing to claim influence over a region where it has no sovereignty, no territory, and no historical presence. China's Arctic strategy is multifaceted. It has invested in icebreaker ships. It has established research stations in Iceland and Norway. It has sent scientists to study Arctic ecosystems. But the most significant element of China's strategy is economic. China is the world's largest trading nation, and it is keenly interested in the potential of Arctic shipping routes. Most of China's Arctic success has come from partnering with Russia. Chinese companies have invested heavily in Russian natural gas projects, particularly the Yamal LNG facility in Siberia. This facility extracts liquefied natural gas from beneath the frozen tundra and ships it to Asia via the Northern Sea Route, a shipping lane that runs along Russia's northern coast. The Northern Sea Route is the only Arctic shipping route currently viable for commercial traffic. In summer, when the ice retreats, ships can travel from Shanghai to Rotterdam via the Arctic Ocean, cutting thousands of kilometers off the traditional route through the Suez Canal. In theory, this route should revolutionize global trade. The distance from Shanghai to Rotterdam via the Northern Sea Route is roughly 13,000 kilometers compared to 21,000 kilometers via the Suez Canal. The fuel savings could be enormous. The fuel savings could be significant. But the reality has not matched the promise. In 2024, only 97 cargo voyages were completed via the Northern Sea Route, most of them Russian exports to China. Compare that to the Suez Canal, which sees over 13,000 ships pass through every year. The problem is reliability. The Arctic Ocean is frozen for most of the year. Even in summer, ice conditions are unpredictable. Ships require icebreaker escorts. Insurance costs are high. Infrastructure along the route is minimal. There are no major ports, no repair facilities, no rescue services. The shipping industry demands certainty. It demands predictable schedules and reliable routes. The Northern Sea Route, for all its theoretical advantages, cannot provide that certainty. Not yet. But China is playing the long game. It is investing in Arctic infrastructure, building relationships with Arctic nations, and positioning itself to take advantage of future opportunities as the ice continues to melt. And the ice is melting. This is the core of the Arctic transformation. The region is warming faster than anywhere else on Earth. The summer sea ice that once covered the Arctic Ocean year-round is disappearing. In 1979, the Arctic Ocean had approximately 7 million square kilometers of sea ice during the summer months. By 2024, that area has shrunk to 4.4 million square kilometers. A loss of 2.6 million square kilometers, an area roughly the size of Argentina, has vanished in less than half a century. The ice is not just shrinking, it is thinning. The thick, multi-year ice that used to dominate the Arctic is being replaced by thinner, seasonal ice that melts and refreezes each year. This makes the Arctic Ocean more navigable, more accessible, and more vulnerable to exploitation. The melting ice is revealing resources that were previously locked beneath the frozen sea. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that the Arctic holds approximately 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas reserves and 13% of undiscovered oil. These are staggering numbers. If accurate, the Arctic contains energy resources worth trillions of dollars. But extracting those resources is extraordinarily difficult. The Arctic environment is remote, harsh, and expensive to operate in. There's little infrastructure, labor is scarce, weather conditions are extreme. Oil spills in icy waters would be catastrophic and nearly impossible to clean up. Despite these challenges, interest remains high. Russia has staked enormous economic and political capital on Arctic oil and gas. Norway operates offshore fields in the Barents Sea. Canada has explored reserves in the Beaufort Sea. The question is not whether these resources exist. The question is whether they can be extracted profitably and sustainably. And then there are the minerals. Greenland in particular holds vast deposits of rare earth elements. These minerals are essential for modern technology, smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, military hardware. Currently, China dominates global rare earth production, controlling approximately 70% of the market. Greenland's rare earth deposits could change that equation. But mining in Greenland presents its own challenges. The island's environment is fragile, the population is small and divided on the question of large-scale mining. The infrastructure required to extract, process, and export minerals would cost billions of dollars. Still, the potential is undeniable. And it explains why China, the United States, and European nations are all courting Greenland, offering investment, infrastructure deals, and diplomatic support. The melting ice is turning the Arctic from a frozen wasteland into a contested frontier, and the competition for that frontier is intensifying. 15 years ago, if you had asked a diplomat or a military strategist to describe the Arctic, they would have used the phrase high north, low tension. It was a region of geopolitical calm, a place where cooperation was the norm. Today, that phrase has been inverted. The Arctic is now high north, high tension. The military buildup is accelerating on all sides. Russia has deployed advanced air defense systems across its Arctic territory. NATO has increased its presence in Norway and Iceland. The United States is expanding its Arctic fleet and developing new Arctic-capable weapon systems. Russian and Chinese Coast Guard ships have conducted joint patrols in the Arctic Ocean. Bombers from both countries have flown together near Alaska. These are not acts of war, but they are acts of posturing, demonstrations of capability and resolve. The worry among defense analysts is that these drills, exercises, and patrols could generate a risky escalation. A miscalculation, an accident, an unmisinterpreted radar signal, or an overly aggressive maneuver could spiral into a crisis. The Arctic Council, which once served as a forum for dialogue, is now largely defunct as a political body. Russia's suspension has left a void. The mechanisms for communication and conflict resolution that existed during the era of cooperation have been weakened, if not destroyed. And the stakes are only getting higher. As the ice continues to melt, as new shipping routes open, as resources become more accessible, the incentives for competition will intensify. China's role is particularly complex. Beijing describes its Arctic activities as purely scientific and economic, focused on research and trade. But Arctic nations see a pattern of behavior that suggests something more strategic. China is building a fleet of icebreakers. It is investing in Arctic infrastructure. It is forming partnerships with Russia that extend beyond simple commerce into military cooperation. The fear is that China is positioning itself to become a dominant player in a region where it has no geographic claim. And Russia, for all its partnership with China, is wary. There is a recognition in Moscow that the more Russia collaborates with China, the more it legitimizes Beijing's claims to be a near-Arctic state. Russia is trading short-term economic and diplomatic gains for long-term strategic risk. The Arctic is becoming a theater of great power competition. The United States, Russia, and China, the three most powerful nations on Earth, are all maneuvering for position in a region that will define the geopolitics of the 21st century. The Arctic is melting. That is not a metaphor, it is a physical reality, driven by climate change. And as the ice retreats, it is revealing a new world, a world of resources, routes, and rivalries. The cooperative vision that Mikhail Gorbachev articulated in 1987 has collapsed. The institutions built to manage the Arctic peacefully are paralyzed by geopolitical conflict. The military forces of the great powers are returning to the frozen north, armed with 21st century weapons and 20th century ambitions. What happens in the Arctic will not stay in the Arctic. The resources extracted from beneath the ice will power economies thousands of kilometers away. The shipping routes that open through the melting sea will reshape global trade. The military bases established on the tundra will project power across continents. The Arctic is no longer a frontier, it is the front line. And the battle for control of the Arctic is a battle for the future of the global order. The clock is ticking, and the world's superpowers are racing north, driven by the oldest logic of empire. Whoever controls the resources controls the future. Subscribe now and stay ahead. When history is written, you'll be one of the few who saw it coming. If you think there's something we missed or a topic you want us to cover, let's discuss it in the comments.